Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Best Management Practices for Roadside Invasive Species. My name is Sean Kittle. I'm the Communications Manager with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and we also have Ari Giller-Leinwall on. He's our Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager. We're going to be leading the webinar today, so thank you all for joining us. And we'll get started. There's Ari, there's me. Okay, quick training overview. We're going to go through some introductions and a little overview of what's up ahead, and then I'm going to talk about invasive species and the right of way. After that, Ari's going to take over and talk about invasive species ID and control techniques, and we'll have a little time at the end for some final questions and closing remarks. 1.25 credits are available for categories 3A, 6A, and 9 for taking this webinar. In order to receive the credits, you must view the entire webinar and you must complete a 10-question evaluation by noon on Friday, July 18th. That is this Friday. You have to get a passing score of 70 or a score of 70 to pass, so you have to get 7 out of the 10 questions. Please make sure that you include your applicator ID number. We also need your mailing address so we can mail you your certificates. If you don't give us your applicator number, DEC will not accept it. So please be sure to include that. It is part of the quiz. You'll see it on there, so please fill that in. And we will give you the link to the quiz at the end of the webinar. Okay, so we're going to give a little introduction to invasive species, but first I always like to kind of just talk about APIP and what we do. I introduced myself. I'm Sean Kittle. Our program manager is Brian Green. He's right in the upper left-hand corner. And we have Ari Giller-Leinwall. You're going to meet Ari in a little bit when he takes over. And we have our new aquatic invasive species manager, Anna Hardiman. She just joined us a few weeks ago. We're very excited to have her on. And then in the lower right, we have Carolyn Kessner. She's our conservation and GIS analyst. So what is APIP? We are the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. We were first established about a quarter of a century ago. Since then, the effort has become statewide. Here's a map on the left. If you live in New York State, you live in one of the 8 PRISMs. PRISM stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. This allows us to communicate across the state to talk about invasive species that are on the way to our PRISM and to help coordinate with other areas on what they can do to get the messaging out about invasives and to manage and monitor for invasive species. APIP is hosted by the Nature Conservancy, and we are funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, which is administered by the DEC. So APIP, we're not going to get too deep into our strategic plan, but I just want to make you aware that we have one. We have 4 goals that relate to the work we do. Goal 1 relates to monitoring and sometimes managing invasive species on land. Goal 2 deals with aquatic invasive species. Goal 3 is my realm. It's communications, education, and outreach. I really have a fun time doing my job because I get to pull all of the goals together and communicate to the public and help educate people. Long story short is it's a lot easier to keep invasive species from spreading than it is to deal with them once they've arrived. So it's very important that we do webinars like this. And again, we thank you all for being part of this webinar. And Ari, we do have people in the waiting room. I'm going to admit them here. And then goal 4 is research and innovation. So we're always looking for new ways to do what we do. We're always looking for ways to improve and to do our work better. And I want to give you a quick recap of some of the work we do, because we're not just asking other people to do the work. We are doing a lot of this work ourselves. We hire summer seasonals, and we have a huge volunteer pool that we draw from. And this just gives you a quick season recap from 2024. 300, almost 400 new sites were surveyed, and over 2,300 were visited in total. We did control at over 450 sites. This is public and private lands. And here's kind of a breakdown of what that looks like. 72% chemical, 26% mechanical, and 1% biological controls. We're going to be talking about some of those a little bit later. We also do traps for spotted lanternfly and emerald ash borer. We do a lot of surveying for invasive species, including some of the forest pests like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and beech leaf disease. Hopefully you have heard of them. And then we do biological control releases for purple loosestrife and emerald ash borer. And I just wanted to show you this map to give you a sense of the huge region, over 6 million acres that we cover. And you can see here um, where some of the monitoring and reporting has been done. It's all over the park. A lot of it is along rights of way, which we're going to be talking a lot about today. A lot of it's also along trails and, of course, in various waterways and water bodies. So we have really three volunteer programs, and I just want to touch on each one because, hey, if you take this webinar and you're interested in doing a little more and you like to be out on the water or you like to hike, we would love to also have you volunteer to kind of help us monitor for invasive species. So first, we have our two aquatic programs, Lake Protectors and Lake Management Tracker. And in short, what these involve, well, Lake Protectors is more of an individual thing. So a volunteer would attend a training, they'd learn how to identify and report aquatic invasive species. Then they would sign up to monitor a lake, and then we ask that they monitor that lake just at least once through September. Most volunteers spend 1 to 3 hours monitoring, but a lot of times they're doing it while they're out kayaking or canoeing anyway. And then we ask that you report your findings back to APIP. That's really important. If you see something, even if you, or if you don't see something, if you're out there monitoring for something and you don't see it, it's good to know that it's not there as well. And with Lake Management Tracker, that's more a core group of volunteers. A lot of times it's a lake association, and they'll participate in this program and they'll track a water body that's being managed for invasive species, usually over a 3 to 5 year period. They'll monitor the location once a year, and then they just kind of help review and provide input. So this is a way of tracking how management efforts are going, and there's training that APIP provides for that. We provide software, we train the volunteers, we store and analyze the data, and we write up an annual report on that. So over here on the right, you can just kind of see an example of what that report might look like. This is for Eurasian water milfoil, and you can see over time how it's sort of how it changed and the abundance is decreasing, which is what we want to see. Forest Pest Hunters is really the terrestrial counterpart to our Lake Protectors program. We train volunteers to look for one of two forest pests. We do hemlock woolly adelgid in the winter. It's just much safer to do that in the winter when they're not on the move. And then in the summer, it's actually coming up in a couple of weeks, we're going to start training people for beech leaf disease. And we just ask that they adopt a trail. We have a trail adoption map. They can pick a trail off of that, or they could pick their own trail. But they go and they'll monitor it for beech leaf disease, and they'll tell us if they do or do not see it. Beech leaf disease and hemlock woolly adelgid are both fairly new to the area, so it's really important that we kind of understand more about them, where they are, how they're moving. That's me actually doing a training I guess it was about a month ago. It was more of a general invasive species training, which we do as well, and that happened down in Wadhams. And just to kind of give you some perspective of how much work our volunteers do, you can see on this map, here's all the points of where they surveyed, about 200 hours, about 40 trails, 171 non-detects, which is good news, and 32 confirmed detections for beech leaf disease. And as I mentioned, our season's going to kick off here in August for beech leaf disease. And then just our 2025 winter survey numbers are in for hemlock woolly adelgid. Again, over 350 hours, about 40 trails adopted, a little over 1,000 non-detects, which is great, but 319 confirmed detections. And you can see a lot of the beech or hemlock woolly adelgid rather is in the Lake George region right now, but it is starting to move kind of northeast. So it's really important we get people out there looking at those trails. APIP provides outreach material. So as I mentioned, it's a lot easier to keep things from spreading than it is to deal with them once we're here. Here's some of the free outreach materials that we have. You can order them on our website. I think one of my favorite ones to hand out is the one on the right here, the Field Guide to Terrestrial Invasive Species of the Adirondacks. It's got about 28 invasive species in it, fits in your pocket. Really nice guide to have out when you're hiking or biking or doing whatever you love to do. And we also provide boot brush signs. So we're going to be talking about not spreading invasive species. Plant fragments, seed fragments can all contribute to spreading invasive species. Boot brush station signs are just a really simple way. You'll find them at various trailheads around the region. And, if people can just brush off their boots before and after they go out on a hike, there's a big reduction to the invasive species that are spread. So what is an invasive species? I'm sure you're You're all wondering, right? So let's make sure we're speaking the same language here. For a species to be considered invasive, it has to be two things. It has to not be native to the ecosystem under consideration, and then it has to be likely to cause some kind of harm to the environment, economy, or human health. It can check for the cause harm to. It can check all three of those boxes. Some of them do, some of them just check one or two of the boxes, but it has to cause harm to the economy, environment, or human health and not be from the area under consideration. So let's give a couple quick examples of that. So on the top there, we have poison ivy. Poison ivy is native to the area, right? So it can't be considered invasive, but it does cause harm to public health. So it checks one of the two boxes. Most people I know do not like poison ivy. They don't want it around, but it's native, so we do not consider it to be an invasive species. Next, we have a tomato. Tomatoes are not native to the region, but they do not cause any kind of harm to the environment, economy, or public health. I would argue that tomatoes in some cases actually contribute to the economy because we have a lot of local farmers who grow them. So a tomato is not invasive. So it is not native, but it does not cause any harm. So it is not considered invasive. The third example we have here, that kind of cool looking flower down there, is swallowwort. So swallowwort used to be considered part of the milkweed family. That did change a year or two ago. Monarch butterfly caterpillars didn't get the memo. They still don't know the difference between swallowwort and milkweed. So swallowwort is not native, but the big problem is that monarch caterpillars, which rely on milkweed to complete their life cycle, they can't distinguish the difference between swallowwort and milkweed, and swallowwort has a chemical that's harmful to the caterpillars. So it does cause harm to the environment by harming the monarch butterflies, and it's not native to the area, so it's considered to be an invasive species. Now, why are some species invasive? What makes them so bad? Well, really, what makes them so bad is they're really good at doing what they do. So I'm just going to check through this list right here. They lack predators and parasites. So Japanese barberry, which is right here in the lower right, that pretty red berry, it's a poor forage for animals in our area. It's covered with these really nasty thorns that tend to keep animals at bay. They're very sharp. Another problem is mice love to hide under this plant because predators don't like to go near it, right? So it's kind of like a little bit of a refuge for mice. Mice can carry ticks, and that also means they could carry Lyme disease. And studies have been done that show that forests that have an abundance of Japanese barberry tend to have higher instances of ticks and Lyme disease. Another thing that makes a species invasive is many of them can produce a lot of offspring or seeds. So in the top left here, you see purple loosestrife, and look at all those seeds. I've heard different numbers on this, but basically one purple loosestrife plant can produce millions of seeds. So if you look at a wetland that's just full of purple loosestrife, and imagine that each one of those individual plants can produce a couple million seeds, that's a huge problem, and that kind of gives you the perspective on how quickly these things can spread. A lot of invasives can also reproduce by multiple means. So in the upper right there, we have yellow iris, which can reproduce by seeds or through these really fast growing rhizomes that spread underground. Many invasive species are generalists. That means they can handle a wide range of conditions like light, soil, moisture, temperature, whereas some of our native species tend to be a little pickier about where they'll grow. A lot of invasive species don't care. The lower left, we have tree of heaven. That's the kind of the sort of tropical looking plant there with the compound leaves. It's an amazing generalist, and it's also a host species of spotted lanternfly, which has not been confirmed in our region yet, but spotted lanternfly love tree of heaven. So we definitely want to keep tree of heaven at bay as well. And then lastly, invasives tend to monopolize resources. So once they're established, they're really hard to get rid of. They could form a monoculture and they'll hog all of the resources for themselves and make life really difficult for native species. And we'll actually have an example of that in the next slide here. So the top right is garlic mustard, and you can see that entire forest understory is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard also releases a toxin that harms the soil fungi that the trees rely on. So not only is it forming this monoculture, but it's also causing harm to some of the native fungi that grow in the area. In the lower left, we have an example of an impact on human health. So giant hogweed, do not mow giant hogweed. Do not whack away at it because it contains this really bad sap. If the sap gets on your skin and then it's exposed to sunlight, it will cause these burns, and they're nasty. I've seen worse than this, but this is pretty bad. And then in the lower right, we have Japanese knotweed. And you can see that the Japanese knotweed has completely taken over that guardrail. It's almost completely taken over the side of the road there. So if there was, somebody blew a tire or something like that or had an emergency, there's nowhere to pull over. And it's also starting to cover up that sign there. This stuff grows really fast. So even if you do cut it, it's going to grow back pretty quickly. So let's talk about invasive species and the right of way. All right, so why should we think about invasive species? Well, they cause harm. These negative impacts the negative effects of invasive species. They can impact road work. They can impact maintenance and construction. If we ignore them, they make the job more difficult, and they can be quite costly in the long run, both just in labor and in like resources and equipment. And in some cases, they can be dangerous. Invasive species also tend to grow really fast. Some can grow up to 2 feet in a couple of weeks. So this is an example of an area where Phragmites is about to take over. Watch the magic. Look at that. So this is before and after, and you can see now that it's just really consumed or well on the way to being completely consumed by Phragmites. Phragmites is a grass that can reach 15 feet in height, and it grows so dense that nothing else can grow underneath it. I kind of alluded to this before, but invasive species can block signage. Excuse me. They grow very quickly, as I just mentioned, and some of them can get really tall. Phragmites can get up to 15 feet. So this is bad in a wild area, but when you have these species growing alongside the road, like in this picture, this is Japanese knotweed, it can easily block signs, guardrails, lines of sight, and all of that can create hazards for drivers. And that, of course, leads to increased maintenance needs. We love this picture because it really just shows the Japanese knotweed spilling over that guardrail. So if you get a species that can grow like a foot in a week, it doesn't take long for it after it's cut to become a problem once again. And again, you can see in this image, the shoulder of the road is completely consumed, which would be bad for an emergency or anything like that. And it's pretty safe to say that this stuff is soon going to begin encroaching upon the roadway if it's not taken care of. So invasive species can cause infrastructure damage too. It's hard to imagine that a little root can cause damage to a road or a foundation, but it can. Some of these species are quite tenacious. They can grow through 3 inches of asphalt or concrete. And of course, the damage is done to infrastructure. It reduces the longevity of the infrastructure. It requires more maintenance, and at the end of the day, it costs more money because now you have to either get rid of this plant and or repair all the damage it has done, which of course leads to increased construction and maintenance costs. Studies have shown that the presence of knotweed on a construction site can add 10% to the total cost of development. So thinking about prevention can really save costs down the line on different projects. And human health impacts. So not only do these species have negative impacts on roadways, they can also affect human health. You might recognize this species. This is wild parsnip. So I talked about giant hogweed earlier. Wild parsnip also has a sap that if it gets on your skin and then the sap is exposed to sunlight, it can cause severe blisters and burning, and it can leave really nasty scars. This is a particularly bad species to hit with a weed eater or a mower, especially without any protective gear. And and the protocol, I believe, if you do get this sap on you, is basically to hide away in a dark room for a few days. You need to scrub it every day. You need to get all that sap off your skin because, again, if you get the sap on your skin, it's fine until you walk into the sunlight. Once it gets exposed to sunlight, there's a reaction and it causes these really nasty burns that I showed you earlier. And there they are again, in case you forgot. All right, and part 3 here, reducing invasive species spread through road construction and maintenance. Let's talk a little bit about that. But before we move on, here's a message from your sponsors. This is slide 30. So on your quiz, there is going to be a question that asks, what image or what invasive species did you see on slide 30? So make a note of it, please. The answer is Japanese angelica tree. So slide 30, Japanese angelica tree, make a note of it. It will be on your quiz. This is one way we make sure that people are sitting through the entire presentation. So slide 30, Japanese angelica tree. All right, so a major way invasive species can be spread is through excavation. The excavation process can open up the seed bank, exposing a layer of invasive seeds that might not have otherwise grown up through the top layer. A lot of invasives are also early colonizers, meaning they can quickly take over an exposed area like this here in the picture before native species have a chance to take root. So it's best to avoid soil disturbance as much as possible, but of course it does happen. Sometimes it has to happen. If you do disturb the soil, try to stabilize it quickly. And if you're using fill, don't bring fill from an area where invasive species are known to be. That's very important. A main way, if I didn't mention it earlier, that invasive species are transported is through human activity. A lot of times we talk about hiking or boating, things like that, seeds getting stuck to people's hiking boots or backpacks or things like that. But truck tires are also another way. Soil is also another way. Which brings us to this. So thinking about moving and maintaining equipment, when equipment is stored, or I'm sorry, where equipment is stored can have an impact. So this staging area here is full of Japanese knotweed. That's the one that was taking over the roadside in the earlier slide. If someone moves these plows, they could easily end up moving plant material as well. All it takes for a lot of invasives, including Japanese knotweed, is just a little bit of a plant fragment. And if that lands somewhere where it's happy, it's going to sprout into a whole new infestation. So it's always best to use staging areas that are free from invasive species. And of course, when moving equipment, always be sure to remove any visible soil and plant material from the equipment. And be sure to check the tire treads too. A lot of little things can hide in those tire treads. Material can be removed using water or high pressured air. If it's a small piece of equipment, like a hand tool, brush can be used to remove it. You could also use a brush on your truck tires as well. This is especially important if invasive species are known to be in the area. So, even if you don't see this, it's a good idea to do everything I just mentioned. But if you have Japanese knotweed embracing your equipment like this, then definitely like be very careful. Try to keep it where it is. Don't move it to a new area. And mowing can also be a huge vector of spread. So we have three species that'll be covered today that can be spread via stem fragments. That's purple loosestrife, common reedgrass, also known as Phragmites, and knotweed, which I've mentioned a lot because it's a problem. Small pieces of these stems can grow roots and further spread the plant. Mowing these species should be avoided, but that said, mowing can also be a good tool for suppressing seed dispersal. Mowing before plants go to seed around August can actually help to mitigate the spread of those plants. With moving mowing equipment should be cleaned prior to moving the equipment to a new location, but at the very least, it should always, always, always be cleaned daily to help mitigate the spread. And if you do remove plants from a site, what should you do with them? Well, the plants in this image have been packed into thick black contractor bags so they can be solarized, which means they're bagged up, they're left in the sun for a few weeks, and that causes the plants to liquefy, at which point they can be brought to a landfill. Or if you have woody shrubs, trees, or vines that do not have any seeds, you can form brush piles with them. And beware of contaminated fill. So going back to excavating, what do you do with contaminated fill is you remove the material from the site. It should be stockpiled on an impervious surface, or you can monitor it to see if any invasive species pop up. So in this photo, you can see, once again, Japanese knotweed is popping up. If plants do show up, you can render those plants non-viable through the methods I just mentioned, like solarizing or herbicides. You should also avoid excavating areas that have knotweed, purple loosestrife, or common reedgrass as they spread, not only through stem fragments, but also through root fragments. So again, this is multiple means of reproducing. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ari. Thank you all for your attention. And I'm going to stop
I
sharing,
think.
Ari, and then I'll let you take over with your screen.
Hello, everybody. We're good. Seeing my screen okay, hopefully.
Yes, I see it. Thank you, Ari.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Sean. I guess just to take a quick break, does anybody have any questions from what Sean was talking about? I really appreciate that rundown of APIP and invasives and what to do with contaminated fill. Um,
I don't see any questions in the chat. If anyone has a question for Ari real quick, you just come off mute and ask.
we'll have time for questions at the end too, but
Yeah,
appreciate it.
and real quick, I'd encourage you too, while Ari's talking, please don't come off mute to ask a question or interrupt him. Just so you could type a question into the chat, and we'll get to it at the end. And then oftentimes when we get to the end Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I'm Ari Giller-Linewall. I'm the terrestrial invasive species manager, and just over a year in, I started April of 2024, joining the APIP team, and it's been a whirlwind since then. I'm really excited to be in this role, having done a fair amount of invasive species management in the Mid-Atlantic and the Southwest, and then still dealing with invasives in the private sector as an arborist. I feel like the Prism network and the work that we do in the Adirondacks is really like answering the right question in terms of like how to address the threats of invasives at a regional level. That involves working at the ground at a local level, but working with so many awesome partners. A lot of it is on the right of way. So I wanted to give sort of a glimpse into how we conduct the work that we do, and then give a breakdown of species that I think we encounter on rights of way in the Adirondacks. Hopefully it turns into a bit of a discussion in terms of like best management practices and how we can work together to best address some of these threats. So in terms of IPM, this is how integrated pest management, we want to address all of our projects with this general approach where we want to scout first, find out where these species are, not just on the ground, but their distribution at a regional level. We'll talk more about that in a second. But once we find the species, we want to make sure that it's the right species. With hogweed, we'll get into some distinguishing features are helpful in terms of that. And then assessing all the options, depending on size, feasibility, could dictate between mechanical and chemical. And there's a lot of promise with biological controls. And then, yes, doing the work, but making sure that you're evaluating, is the work effective? So I think this framework is really important in terms of like stepping on each of these aspects as opposed to just conducting control alone. So integrated pest management, certainly. Sean went into these general approaches where within APIP and in general, it's mechanical, chemical, and biological. Depends on the species here. So I'll touch on these as we get into the species specifics. Chemical can mean more than just foliar spraying. So I'll get into some of the best management practices with lower residual impacts, systemic injections for trees, and stem injection for knotweed being an example. And biological controls offer a lot of promise. APIP released emerald ash borer biological controls, 3 species of parasitoid wasps. So that's a very exciting project where those releases are done, but now we're monitoring to see if they established. That is happening with hemlock woolly adelgid biocontrols that are being released across New York State. So it's really exciting to see these biological controls managing populations, suppressing populations of the invasives, and multiplying, establishing themselves. So that gives me a lot of hope long term. So a lot of these lessons are learned by APIP staff. We work with a contract crew and 2 in-house seasonals. And Sean gave this breakdown, but even with the amazing work that we do in-house, it would not be possible with all the partners in terms of different agencies up here in the Adirondacks, citizen scientists. We're working with the Forest Pest Hunter program. So some of the species that we're really on a like keen eye out for in the Adirondacks are ones that we don't even know of in the area yet, like porcelain berry and Japanese hops. Thankfully, the reports that have come in have not been those species, but we're certainly going to keep an eye out. And we only have a few giant hogweed sites throughout the Adirondacks that we know of. So whether it's for sure that species or not, IMAP invasives would be the best way to report things like that. I'd love to hear about it and get eyes on it. And then there's some species that are very much in the area, but very limited distribution. So Japanese angelica tree and tree of heaven, some clonal trees that are certainly of interest, and mile-emitted and Japanese stiltgrass also. New York is certainly a nexus of invasive species for a variety of reasons. So we certainly want to keep an eye out with transportation corridors and rights of way, certainly be an example of that. But I wanted to point out, I mean, rights of way, yes, but they are coming in from all over. Thankfully, we've got an amazing boat steward program throughout the state, throughout the Adirondacks. That's really trying to address that watercraft transport on the boats themselves and on trailers. Contaminated fill, we're certainly talking about today. Not moving firewood is another important way of transporting invasive species with forest pests. I think it's about 50 miles is the recommended distance, but we'll talk about that leading edge of these different pests where we're really trying to keep the spread from going, but certainly like just complete prevention to avoid planting things like barberry and planting native or at least non-invasive plants would certainly help the cause as well. So within APIP, we have fairly limited resources, so we need to prioritize our projects. One way that we do this is prioritizing widespread species just to priority areas. So like Phragmites and knotweed, we certainly cannot feasibly eradicate from the Adirondacks, but we do try to limit spread. So that's why we work on rights of way and along sensitive areas. So where there's threatened species, wetlands, stream corridors. But some of the species that I'm really going to highlight today, we're still in this containment, eradication, and just keeping an eye out because we know it's close by. So these tier structures, I think this really helps prioritize the work, keeps us efficient and effective within the PRISM network. And I think it's a really good model to follow in general. Sort of this flattening the curve, I think makes a lot of sense. One of the ways that we do that in terms of how do we set these tiers is looking at distributions across the state and across the Adirondacks and IMAP invasives. So this is where I really could use everybody's help. You can register for an IMAP invasives account through the website, imapinvasives.com. But then if you get the IMAP app on your phone, that allows you to be out in the field. And if you see something, say something. The IMAP team and myself were on there reviewing incoming observations. So this is a great way where whether you're part of our Forest Pest Hunter volunteer program or you're just out hiking, boating, covering rights of ways, this is a super straightforward way to get that info straight over to conservation professionals across the state and right here in the Adirondacks. So in terms of the management plans, I want to start talking about plants. Let's get into some of these species. So I'm going to start with the ones that Sean highlighted that are more widespread in the region, but I also want to touch on some of the emerging species and forest pests as well. So common reedgrass, Phragmites, can grow extremely quickly. It certainly is a clonal plant. Something that I use for ID when I'm driving at driving speeds is this plume of seeds at the top. And also the leaves, sort of this light green, almost bluish color. a really key ID in terms of there is a native Phragmites that is pretty limited in distribution in the Adirondacks, and the very widespread invasive Phragmites are these ligules. There are more prominent hairs in the invasive Phragmites. The stems themselves of the native Phragmites, the plant just looks punier to me. Typically, it's like only a couple feet tall from what I've seen, and the stems are predominantly red. So that's the biggest factor for me. The invasive Phragmites, I do not see red on the stems. In terms of right-of-way management, the major concern with Phragmites is that extension, it grows from root stems. Not only is that a concern in terms of control, but it is astounding. If you have the amount of non-chlorophyll root growth, like a plant that's 5 feet tall, easily 20 feet of just tuber root growth. So I think it's difficult to excavate soil effectively as a control method, and that's where chemical really comes into play. Um, Reed canary grass is also an invasive. I find that seed, the plume, to be quite different in terms of an ID. The ligule, I suppose, is different with the native Phragmites, but I really use that red stem as the main ID there. In terms of management of common reed, if only very emerging populations would I do mechanical. If you do have a single root fragment that's establishing a new plant, I would be careful to remove that entire root system. And then like a truly early detection, rapid response standpoint, mechanical certainly possible. Excavation, I think you probably could do, but like Sean was mentioning, you need to be quite careful with that contaminated soil. I would either put it in a contained area or solarize that entire pile. At the very least, monitor and don't spread around until you're confident that invasives are not present. Foliar spray can be quite effective with Phragmites. Glyphosate has a much lower half-life in the environment and the water than imazapyr. So I would tend to only use imazapyr in upland sites. And I did want to point out clip and drip for Phragmites too. I have a picture of that later. But if you have sensitive species around the Phragmites, you can cut individual stems and drop herbicide directly in the cut stems. And that really lowers the potential impact to surrounding plants. I also wanted to dive into Japanese knotweed. Certainly, this is another plant that can spread from root fragments and is fairly widespread. There's several different species. Bohemian knotweed is a hybrid between Japanese and giant knotweed. But basically, their growth habit is quite similar. Their habitat is quite similar, and they're all invasive. So I'm just going to discuss them as knotweed in general. These heart-shaped triangular leaves and red stems when they're new growth, and then more established stems here is what I use for ID. Yes, there are purple splotches also. When these canes are dormant, they can be cut and moved around. It's the live root fragments that we're the most worried about in terms of spreading, but certainly don't compost any of that material. I think it's a good practice just to solarize in general, to keep in bags in the sun for multiple weeks. I'm not sure if there's any seeds viable in these flowers. It's certainly possible. I'd say the main mechanism of spread for knotweed is from root fragments. And we're seeing these rhizomes here. It is such a generalist, like Sean was saying, it can grow through multiple inches of concrete. And that's why I think chemical is a very valuable tool in the toolbox with Phragmites, because it can circulate down into the roots. Digging it, I found it quite hard to remove all of this root material. Yes, knotweed certainly in the generalist category in terms of its adaptation as an invasive. Yeah, the bindweed leaves can look similar to knotweed, but it's certainly that's more of a twining herbaceous plant, and it doesn't have those canes at all. Horsetail, you're not going to see any leaves, but that does have a similar shaped stem. So for knotweed management, again, with very small emerging populations, it can be dug up. I would be quite careful of that plant material. So bagging and solarizing makes sense. Stem injection is an effective technique here. And there's a picture of a former APIP teammate doing a stem injection here. As with foliar treatment, the best time for Phragmites and knotweed chemical control is midsummer to late summer. Into fall, what you want to avoid in terms of that tail end of the treatment window is when the ground freezes or the plant freezes. So we try to stop treatments 2-3 weeks before frost because we need that chemical to circulate down into the root system to be effective. So a bit of a breakdown in terms of knotweed injection. There are a couple different manufacturers that make this equipment. You're just using undiluted glyphosate and injecting between the second and third node of the stem. That photo 3 on the bottom right there, I like the orange highlighter. There's some systems where that actually mounts onto the injector, so you're leaving a mark as you're injecting. In a pretty large patch of knotweed, I find that quite helpful in terms of keeping track. Another important note in terms of this injection is you need a fairly girthy stem around the diameter of like pinky finger or penny. So a good tool in the toolbox, but depending on what infestation you're trying to address, it might make sense to do a multi-tool, multi-treatment sort of approach, injecting your mature stems, but also doing foliar treatment for some of those smaller plants with stems that aren't girthy enough. If they're too small, the needle will like actually break the stem and rupture it versus holding the herbicide inside, like we're seeing here with something this size. So purple loosestrife is another sort of riparian wet habitat plant that is of concern in the Adirondacks. A key distinguishing factor in terms of ID are these leaves that clasp to the stem, and the stem itself is square. So I definitely use that for identification. These flowers are of concern because they form seeds that can have millions of seeds. So a stopgap control I certainly wanted to bring up is even if you have a big patch where it's not feasible to spray or otherwise mechanically control, deadheading these flowers or seeds before they are mature can certainly like be a stopgap in having the established populations establish further, like we're seeing in this picture here. They can be dormant in the soil for several years. So this is where soil disturbance and more active restoration, where soil has to be disturbed in areas where we know purple loosestrife is present, might help the spread or help minimize the spread, I should say. Because purple loosestrife is certainly in the power by numbers adaptation category with these millions of seeds per plant. I'm curious if folks have seen fireweed in the Adirondacks or in New York State. I do find the flowers to be a similar color signature, but quite a different shape. Another early colonizer that I'm more familiar with in the Western US. Is there fireweed in New York? If anyone knows, feel free to throw that in the chat. Blue vervain, different color flower, doesn't have those clasping leaves, but a nice native riparian plant. So a good example of being sure you know what you're dealing with. Purple loosestrife management, digging can work, but you need to get that whole root system. As I was saying, deadheading flowers or seeds before they are mature is another good stopgap method. Do not mow these plants when they're in seed, but mowing before they are in seed can be decent in terms of control. I also want to highlight that there is a biocontrol for purple loosestrife, the Gale Russella beetles. These are sustaining in the Adirondack region. So we have capture sites and then we release in different sites. It's a little tricky. It's a great suppression method. This doesn't eradicate loosestrife, but it certainly keeps it from spreading and taking over riparian areas. I say it's a bit tricky because the areas can't be mown, they can't be flooded, and they need these invasive plants as a host. It's all they feed on, thankfully, with biocontrol. So they're quite vetted in that way to make sure that they don't try to feed on any native plants. So it's good in terms of suppression. I would consider the project a success. But in terms of EVRR, when we see single plants emerging, that's where we rely more on chemical or mechanical controls. This is for more suppressing established populations. Let's talk about some phytotoxic plants. We'll start with the most prominent, most widespread, which is wild parsnip. Um, a lot of plants in this family have a similar umbel-shaped flower. Umbel, sort of like an upside down umbrella is how I envision these. So with wild parsnip, the leaves are more compound than some of the other species we'll look at. It's a biennial, so year one you will just see these set of leaves, and then year two you have the stalks and the umbels. Um, Mostly green stem on the wild parsnip, and here we're seeing mature seeds. So as Sean was saying, mowing into like mid-August and onward, somewhat variable based on where your location is. But mowing, once this has gone to seed, will actively spread the plant. But mowing when it's still in flower will actually suppress the populations. They've spent all this energy forming the seeds. They're not mature yet. They get mown. Several years of doing that will truly suppress the populations. So it's an important one. Timing of the mowing or of the control based on where the plant's at in its phenology is incredibly important. Um, Small infestations, like some of the work we do in DEC campgrounds, these plants can be very effectively dug. I don't know if anyone else has found that root slayer shovel with the serrated sides, but that is a nice tool to have in the toolbox for sure. Be careful of golden Alexander on the left versus that wild parsnip on the right, similar leaf shape. And then cow parsnip is actually a native. So that's one you also want to be careful of. The phytotoxic sap is a significantly larger plant. Both those umbels are larger. The leaf is less compound, but more deeply serrated. And then giant hogweed is another invasive of the same family that I want to touch on. The umbels are massive and the leaves are massive. So that's a key differentiator. These umbels can be like 2.5 feet wide and the leaves up to 5 feet wide. Compared to wild parsnip, I find these leaves to be way more deeply toothed and a bit more serrated. The purple splotches on the stem are a key differentiator. Um, there may be some like purple hairs on the giant hogweed, but these purple splotches, that is a key differentiator for giant hogweed. There's another picture of it. First year growth, you'll just see something like this, and then it takes off in the second year due to that huge taproot. Angelica is similar. That purple stem is a key differentiator. Purple stem Angelica is a native. It is not phytotoxic. And that leaves us with this amazing chart. I really appreciate all the observations that come in, especially when it comes to giant hogweed, because of the human health threats that it presents. I frequently rely on this chart and ask for detailed pictures because there's a lot of similarities between these plants. But the Angelica, it's less of an umbel flower and more of like softball shaped balls. Um, the purple stem as well, more compound leaves. Cow parsnip, still a native, but be careful because now we're phytotoxic. Um, that's not going to have this purple splotches on the stems. It's generally going to have smaller leaves and smaller flowers. They're still massive, but we're talking relative to giant hogweed. And that's where you have the more serrated leaves on the mature plants and that the purple splotches. So hopefully a decent rundown of these different phytotoxic plants and looks likes. One of the reasons I'm really touching on it is the phytodermatitis, the 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 glucoside, the chemical that's actually in the cow parsnip, the giant hogweed, and then the lower concentration of the wild parsnip. It's not so much that it directly causes injury, but it completely breaks down your skin's protection to UV. So within 15 minutes of contact, you really need to wash it off and get covered up as soon as you can. I would say like emergent care, but in the field, making sure you can do positive ID, avoid it if you can. If you know you're going to be working directly in it, to wear eye protection, havoc protective clothing, and then having ample wash water and change of clothing. Um, Definitely something to be careful of. Plants are very impressive. I would consider this to be a fairly angry plant. So mowing, I think with the proper equipment, weed whacking or brush cutting, I would avoid completely with something like wild parsnip or giant hogweed. What we do for control of giant hogweed is digging, including the taproot, or chemical control. All right. We can relax in terms of phytodermatitis for a second. We're getting more into widespread plant where I wish we could do more control, but it's tough because birds are actively distributing the seed of bush honeysuckle. Um, these leaves, um, to me, the color signature is different. They tend to leaf out earlier. So in the understory of infested areas, this is a lot of times the first leaves that I see in the area. The saccharine smelling flowers and these seeds that are actively dispersed by birds. I don't think they have incredibly high nutritional value for wildlife, and it's certainly an environmental threat in terms of overtaking forest understory. In terms of key differentiator, the stems of bush honeysuckle are going to be hollow, so that's a pretty important factor. In terms of best management practices and threats to roadside in the Adirondacks and the region at large, I certainly wanted to discuss Oriental bittersweet. This is another species that's readily dispersed by birds. Um, but it's not only a understory invader, but actively twines up mature trees and can kill them and threaten the upper story, creates a major disturbance. So I have a picture here of an Adirondack campground area, and I wanted to bring this up as how should we manage this area? How do we prevent this from happening elsewhere? This is certainly not a one and done area in terms of management or restoration. Um, but I think it serves for discussion for a couple different reasons. It might not be feasible to eradicate Oriental bittersweet from this area, but certainly at least cutting windows from otherwise healthy trees could be beneficial, meaning cutting the live vines down from the trees, not trying to pull them down. I think that would be quite dangerous, but cutting live growth and then both at head height and then at ground level. This could be a multi-visit approach as well in terms of after cutting the windows, doing chemical or mechanical control of the ground cover. And then eventually those vines are likely coming from tubers in the ground. So you could do a cut stump treatment down the road, once you have like most of the above ground control, you can find those tubers and do really targeted chemical treatment. But this is a multi-year project. It's certainly of concern for the Adirondacks because we'll touch on some of the forest pests in later slides. But as we have pests moving into the region, like beech leaf disease, like emerald ash borer, we likely will have more openings in the canopy as we have mortality of some of the canopy trees. And so really keeping some of these early invaders at bay is quite important in terms of what fills in these canopy gaps if we lose trees, whether it's to storm damage or potentially to forest pests. So the BMPs for vine management certainly works for Oriental bittersweet, similar to kudzu control, but I think quite important to keep in mind. Something else that I wanted to bring up species-wide that's just emerging in the Adirondacks, but is a huge threat, especially for transportation corridors. Japanese stiltgrass, I think, is readily spread by seed fragments and then contaminated fill. And so we're just starting to observe this in the Adirondacks. So I definitely want to point out, if you see this in the Adirondack region, please report it. We'd love to suppress, contain, even eradicate these populations before they become more widespread. So this off-center white silvery midrib, that's really key in terms of keying out Japanese stiltgrass. And the seeds, it goes to seed later in the summer. So pulling can be quite effective in small populations prior to seed set. But I think the seed, it can exist a long time in the seed bank. So control of Japanese stiltgrass can be quite difficult. This is what we're looking at right now in the Adirondacks. It's really just contained to the Lake George watershed. So there are a number of active control areas, but we also want to keep an eye out. I want to make sure that there's no other Japanese stiltgrass in the region. So that's this ID with the silver midrib. If you're seeing really dense patches of this, please report it. I'd love to hear about it. This white grass or cut grass is probably not going to be growing as densely and will not have the midrib. So yeah, Japanese stiltgrass, definitely on our radar. Mowing before it is in seed can be a very effective control, as well as burning using a weed torch. I think with Japanese stiltgrass, it's not one tool in the toolbox, but a multi-method control approach. But we really want to keep these at bay. I think these monocultures really could be monocultures and be crowding out much else. So generally, we rely on passive restoration. We have enough native species in the area to fill in after our control projects. And Japanese stiltgrass is of concern because it certainly could impede that. Another emerging invasive in the Adirondacks is swallowwort. There's pale and black swallowwort. I'm going to discuss them as similar. Their growth habitat is certainly similar. I have found them to occur mostly in disturbed areas, right at the edge of woodlands, former fields, roadsides. As Sean mentioned, the leaves look somewhat different than milkweed, but similar enough where the monarch butterfly larvae, the adults lay their eggs and these plants cannot sustain the monarch butterfly larvae. The seeds form in these pods right around this time of year in the Adirondacks. And yeah, these flowers are pretty inconspicuous, fairly small. This is the main differentiator I use for species between black and white, or black and pale swallowwort. The pale swallowwort flowers are fairly white. And then these seeds disperse both in air and water. So in terms of like if you're close to a culvert or something, I think these would readily spread in rain events and move in water. Um, Mechanical control in small populations certainly can be done. It's just important, like with this picture on the bottom here, that you don't just get the stem, but actually get below the root crown. You certainly can have pretty vigorous resprouting if you're just cutting or mowing only. So let's get into some clonal trees. This presents an interesting problem because these are woody established trees that can resprout pretty vigorously when cut. So the first I want to discuss is Japanese Angelica tree. I think the only known Japanese Angelica tree site in the Adirondacks probably came in from contaminated fill and was reported just from a homeowner that knew what they were looking at. So it's a great example of early detection, rapid response, and keeping an eye out, making sure that there's not more. These leaflets are a key differentiating factor, I would say. I believe it is, yeah, it looks like opposite branching to me. And then this inflorescence at the top of more mature trees is another key differentiator, especially compared to native devil's walking stick. Um, the treatment window here, we've got some more time. The best time to treat these trees is once they are in flower before seeds are mature. There's a trend there. That's generally the best time to treat invasives. But this plant doesn't go to seed until late summer, early fall. Um, so certainly want to point out those thorns on the bark of more mature and even immature trees is a pretty key ID. But what we've noticed in the infestations we found is the clonal colony nature of the growth. So you have these more mature trees. They may have viable seeds, but they are spreading via underground roots. So it's this clonal colony situation. I'll get into BMPs after I talk about a bit more established clonal tree in the Adirondack region, Tree of Heaven, Alanthus. Um, I think that this tree is quite a generalist. It seems like it can grow without much nutrients, and it has some allelopathic properties. So it can inhibit other plant growth in the soil where it grows. How do you know you're dealing with Tree of Heaven? Especially from this picture, if I was driving at 50 miles an hour, I'd wonder if I was looking at sumac or not. Um, the seeds are different on sumac, but when you get up close, excuse me, you have these wings at the base of the leaves. That is a key differentiator for Tree of Heaven. And it's a virtual webinar, thankfully, because if you crush up these leaves, it gives off a pretty distinct, somewhat noxious odor. I compare it to rotten peanut butter. Sumac's not going to do that. So between the smell of the crushed leaf and these notches at the base, I'd say that's the best way to differentiate Tree of Heaven from sumac. Yeah, the sort of furled looks to me like a bittersweet bark, if you will, to Tree of Heaven. And then the fruit is, this is how it spreads over distance. Looks almost like a maple seed. It's called a samara. And this, the heart-shaped leaf scars is another distinguishing factor here. So as I was mentioning, both Angelica tree and Tree of Heaven produces root suckers in response to mechanical control. I think this is true to an extent, even with herbicide. So one of the most effective methods of control for Angelica tree or Tree of Heaven is via basal bark, spraying concentrated herbicide on the bark itself. That presents a bit of a hazard from a tree aspect. If you have a mature tree and you're leaving it standing, that could present a risk if it fell on, say, a structure or a trail. So some thoughts there. You could rely on cut stump or cut stump treatments, and then just I would plan on addressing some resprouts with Tree of Heaven or with Angelica tree. If you're in an area where you can have a standing dead tree, I think that's where hack and squirt or basil bark, more concentrated chemicals directly on the bark itself, would be more effective. A thought there is maybe treating in the fall, letting that chemical circulate throughout the fall, and then cutting the following spring. I think then you'd reduce your risk a little bit in terms of having a standing dead tree, but also have less potential for resprouting. Um, it's also quite possible if you have a bunch of resprouted like saplings of Tree of Heaven, if the entire root system's pulling up, I don't want to say don't do mechanical. If you can get that whole root system up, I think it's certainly feasible, but definitely want to give an air of caution in terms of the potential for rigorous resprouting with Japanese Angelica tree and Tree of Heaven. So some more pictures of Tree of Heaven here, and the fairly limited known distribution in the Adirondacks. Very limited, almost no mature trees up in Bolton or Warrensburg. And then down in this French Mountain area and Hadlock Pond, we know of some established populations, and we're working on suppression. Um, So a bit of a recap in terms of clonal tree control. Cut and stump, hack and squirt, basil bark, I think are the best approaches for mature trees. And then it's a multi-method approach. Those aren't going to be as effective for those emerging small tree saplings. And so I think a foliar treatment there makes the most sense. Um, Quick chemical note, if you're using triclopyr, Garlon 3A versus Garlon 4 Ultra, same active ingredient, but different formulation. Be quite careful, like a day like today, I would not be using either. Consult your label always with herbicides, but volatilization is a concern at certain temperatures. 85, 90 degrees. So by midday today, even up here in the Adirondacks, I would not be using these chemicals. The concern is at a certain temperature, those liquid particles, when sprayed, would turn into a gas. They would volatilize and then take them where the wind takes them. So even the non-target damage is that today would be an unacceptable day to use these chemicals. So valuable tools to have in the toolbox, but you need to make sure that you're doing what you can in terms of like species ID, like we've been talking about, but then also the environmental conditions. Is the day the right day to be using these chemicals? Today for triclopyr is not. Um, On to some forest pests. I bring up spotted lanternfly because its preferred host tree is Tree of Heaven, but it is a generalist. I've seen it on all sorts of trees downstate. It is not established in the Adirondacks yet, but we are actively looking for it. Um, I've seen pictures of it still in its nymphal stage. This is a little bit harder to spot, a little bit harder to ID. But this is the poster child. I can't think of many other plants, or excuse me, many other insects that looks like this. It's in the leaf hopper family, but I have not seen other leaf hoppers with this distinct pattern or color. I bring it up in this roadside invasives webinar because these eggs are not just laid on trees, but on all sorts of bricks and trailers. And so I think these eggs could be actively transported around, and it certainly could be a point of introduction for the Adirondack region. A concern with lanternfly is that although it prefers Tree of Heaven, it certainly can affect grapes, hops, apples. So there's a bit of an economic threat there. Um, so what we're doing in the Adirondacks is we've got a network of partners and volunteers that are putting traps up both at those tree of heaven locations that we talked about before, and at high visitation areas like boat launches, campgrounds, visitor centers. So this is a great example of using these transportation corridors as a monitoring network to track potential introductions to the region. Hemlock lily adelgid, this is another pest that's emerging in our region. We know of it along the shores of Lake George, but we certainly want to keep an eye out everywhere. Um, Best way to identify it generally in the winter time, where the insects overwinter and have this woolly layer. So you can see the cisterns, the actual hemlock lily adelgid there in black. But when we're out surveying for this, we're really looking for this white wool. Um, they feed at the base of the hemlock needles, um, and that it's really like a death by 1,000 cuts situation, sort of like a scale insect, where they impede new growth of hemlocks. And so the existing needles generally fall off like every 3 years or so. So an infested tree can hang on for a bit, and we're actively doing control and survey to figure out where these guys are. So shout out to the forest pest hunters and to so many partners that are working on this. You can see all the detects in green and non-detects in brown here, but then also this entire new population that was found down in Lake Sacandaga, close to Hadley. So just another ask for help. If you're looking at hemlock trees, if you care about hemlock trees and you're working throughout rights of way or hiking in the Adirondacks, keep an eye out and please report so we can get our best distribution if we can.
Hey, Ari, just a heads up, it's about 11:15 now.
Perfect. So I think I got my last forest pest here, or we got two. Emerald ash borer. Um, Big thing with emerald ash borers, you're looking for these D-shaped exit holes. That's when the larvae are leaving the ash trees. Unfortunately, if you're seeing that, they've probably already formed galleries from their feeding. This is a bit more of an immediate threat to the individual tree versus hemlock lily adelgid because it's actually girdling the tree. It's like damaging that cambium layer. So when you're out surveying like this tree here, we really want to see those D-shaped exit holes to get a positive confirmation. But the woodpeckers are giving us signs that there may be emerald ash borer larvae in there. From a distance, I tend to look for flagging branches, especially dead canopy branches, londing bark, where the bark is starting to flake off or turn brown. And then I zoom in and like for IMAP invasives to get a positive confirmation, I'd really look for those D-shaped exit holes. Or like what we're doing in the Adirondacks is setting out some traps to just delineate that leading edge. Emerald ash borer is both coming in from the northeast, but also it's now in most of Warren County. And yeah, so we really want to be prepared for forest pests in general. I don't think that we're going to be able to stop them in their tracks, but I'm really excited with our biocontrol work in terms of like, I don't think these species are on their way to be extinct in the region, but certainly major changes are coming. So I definitely want to, probably for a future presentation, given the amount of time we have, think proactively about this. Inventory as is for like municipalities or land managers, inventory, what we have, prioritize stands, think about invasives control in that area, knowing that we're probably going to have major canopy gaps. So food for thought moving forward. I'm not sure that our transportation corridor practices are going to make or break this, but I think it's something that is going to affect all of us and we all should be working together on. Beech leaf disease is also a forest pest that's actively, quickly moving through our region. The banding on the leaves is that key differentiator on the right there. And stay tuned. We've got a beech leaf disease forest pest hunter season planned for this summer. And we'll post more about that. Probably an event in August for some in-person ID as well. Quick beach leaf disease map. This one is certainly moving west from Lake George, but also in the western and southwestern Adirondacks. So this one's certainly on the move. Gonna skip questions until the end. Sean covered a lot of this contaminated fill practices, but I think this would go a long way in terms of inventorying and controlling invasives before work starts in terms of construction and rights of ways projects, exclusion areas when they're feasible, and then certainly like avoiding infested areas, having staging areas that are monitored and controlled, and inspecting and cleaning equipment, pressurized washing with containment, removing dirt, seeds, and plant material. And then with the plant material itself, solarizing, drying in a contained area, burying, burning are all feasible options. Um, Quick chemical best management practices. I touched on environmental conditions briefly, but certainly if rain is in the forecast, I prefer multiple hours, ideally 12 hours for rain fastness. Aquatic safe surfactant is important, especially if you're applying near wet areas or riparian areas. And I want to leave everybody time for questions. So I could go back to some material, but I do want to open it up for questions or comments for anybody. So I might even stop sharing a screen so I can see y'all.
Oh, we do have
Or I
one
put
question in
everybody
the
to sleep.
we do have one question in the chat. I don't know if you know the answer, Ari. Do people who have had their skin damaged from giant hogweed, are they more prone to have skin cancer in those areas?
Oh my goodness.
It's a good
I,
question. I don't know.
I don't know. And to be honest, I don't know the details of like UV damage to skin cancer. Like don't get a sunburn. That can present a skin cancer risk. So I hear where you're going, Jane, but I don't have a specific answer for you.
If anyone else has a question for Ari, feel free to come off of mute, and I'm going to post the link to the quiz in the chat here in just 1 minute. Let me grab it for you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you guys use Garlon 3A or not?
No, we don't. That's a product I've used in the past, but we just use 4 Ultra.
Yeah, because my experience as a New York applicator is that Garlon 3A is not allowed for sale in New York, but it is in all other states. And from my experience as an applicator in Connecticut and Massachusetts, it's a far more effective and safer product. So something that I would like to work on is getting the state DEC to allow us to use Garlon 3A because it's just a far superior product. The issue that I have with Garlon 4 is exactly what you talked about, the volatilization, as well as that it's an oil-based product, so its translocation capacity, especially adjacent to a wetland, is far higher than Garlon 3A.
Very good points, Christian. Yeah, contact me directly. I have not done this before, but there certainly are like categorical exemptions with New York State. So there's like 2 EE permits or product registrations that New York can, like exceptions that they could put in. So I wonder if that's a possibility. And I feel like I'm getting my cables crossed a little bit because, yeah, it's 3A. I think you have less risk of volatilization, but there's way more eye hazard. So it's like there's not a perfect solution. But knowing what chemicals you're dealing with is key.
Yeah, the speaking on the eye hazard, my experience with that from reading the label and using it is it's only in its concentrated form. So obviously, in the hands of an untrained applicator or an average citizen, that would be a problem. But for a trained applicator who's putting that concentrate directly into a tank and mixing it, then, you know, I just, the risk is worth the reward as far as efficacy.
Yeah, well, and I think that's in the context of New York State, that would be the categorical exemption, the 2E. And Christian, you don't need to hear this from me, but I want to say it to the group is like when you're mixing chemicals, that's some of the highest applicator risk in terms of that surface tension. If you're putting, from a measuring cup, that Garlon 3A into a tank mix, if it splashes back up, that's not a tank mix. That's undiluted 3A. So you need to be quite careful, as I'm sure you are. Um, Ryan,
The
thank you for that clonal tree link. I'm going to check that out later. I appreciate that.
The link to the quiz is in the chat. I put it in there a couple times, everyone. The quiz will go live at 11:30. So if you click on it now, it's going to say it's not accepting responses. Wait till like 11:31 and you should be able to get into it. So make sure you copy that. Go into the chat and copy that link so you have it.
If we don't have more questions, I'll hop back on for like a couple more slides, talk about chemical things. You're seeing my slides again?
Yes.
Yeah, so Christian was talking about it. In terms of tank mixing, we may already all know, but if we don't, like best practices for tank mixing is fill up your tank with like roughly half the amount of water and then add your ingredients. What we tend to use is herbicide, an aquatic safe surfactant, and an indicator dye, and then add your remaining water. You want to shake up this mixture, and assuming that your backpack is clean, you do want to circulate that pump and the wand back into the tank so you have active mix when you go to spray that first plant. Do I have control over the slides? Yes. So a couple other notes in terms of foliar spray and chemicals is I like an adjustable nozzle because you can adjust the droplet size on demand. So I don't want to see any of the material running off the leaf, but you need like 80, 90+% coverage to have effective control on these plants with a lot of foliar control. So the surfactant, generally I mix it about 0.5%, but if I have a waxier cuticle or a wetter leaf, I will knock that surfactant up a little bit. I'm also learning of a waxy type material as a surfactant that requires incredibly low volumes for Phragmites, but I don't know enough about it for this presentation. I'll report back. Best practices in terms of treatment is don't spray yourself in. If you have a large infestation, work from the furthest edge out. So you're treating furthest away from your end point. You're working yourself out. So you're not having to travel through treated areas. That's another reason why like mapping the infestation first can help. So you're not going through treated areas. And always consider target species distribution and phenology. If you're spraying something that's already gone into seed, you're probably not using your time super effectively. If it's a very stressed plant, even if you don't have rain in the forecast, if your target organism is not uptaking your treatment, then it's probably not a very effective treatment. In terms of being efficient, if you're doing a cut stump, just applying chemical to that cambium layer is all you need. You don't need to treat deadwood. And then we got some close-ups in terms of the hack and squirt and injection and clip and drip for Phragmites. So closing it down with a bit of chemical best practice management. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right. Thanks, Ari.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'm going to put the link to that quiz in the chat one last time for everyone. There it is. And a reminder, it'll go live in about 3 or 4 minutes here. It goes live at 11:30.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah,
It's been
thank you,
good
Ryan.
spending the morning with you. And yeah, you've got my contact info. Anyone, please reach out with any more questions, concerns, and keep it up with those IMAP points. It informs our work so much. It's really appreciated.
Yeah, and as a reminder, please, when you fill out the quiz, if you're looking for those credits, which I assume if you're filling out the quiz, that's what you're looking for, make sure you put your ID number in there. We need your name as well. DEC is going to need that or it won't go through. And then if you want to get your certificate mailed to you, then you need to put in your mailing address as well. So please do not skip those fields. They are very important. And the recording rather, will go live Friday afternoon after the quiz closes. Okay, thanks everyone. Ari, do you have anything else?
No, that's it for me.
All
Appreciate
right.
everything that you all do. Have a good rest of the day.
All right. Bye everyone. Thank you so much.
See you.